So you're going to get a job as a film crew person when you graduate, yeah. Well, unfortunately today I forgot to bring in my classic album of the week, so I'll have to bring one in on Monday and Friday of next week. But I had mentioned the two different views of proportional voting, and this was in the this is from the David Johnson piece, both of which are in the folder. But I found it interesting that Johnson said there is no simple explanation of the single transferable vote on the droop quota, so hopefully an example will clarify the process, right? So they give you a much bigger example than I gave you. But it's also interesting that in the article, How Proportional Representation Elections Work, which is also in there, says, but in reality, the principles of underlying proportional representation systems are very straightforward, and all the systems are easy to use. So it sort of depends on your view of the world. Anyway, we, last time we finished up this proportional representation. Again, if you look at the old exams, oftentimes they'll ask you to just briefly explain how the single transferable vote works, or I might ask you for the greatest remainder or greatest average. So what you probably ought to do is write that out. All right. So even if you sort of know it in your head, you should probably write it out a couple times before you are writing it in your blue book, so that when you're under the pressure of 55 minutes or whatever, you don't go, oh yeah, how did that work, right? So just write it out a couple times. I think that'd be useful. I'll also be obviously pretty straightforward on questions that I'm asked on the exam. And again, some old exams are in there, and some old sample essay questions are in there as well. So go ahead over the weekend and just go ahead and take a look at those. Again, the review session will be Thursday. So, if you have something that you can't figure out, make sure you raise your hand at the review session, and we can make sure we go over that. So, excuse me, before we start on the next component here on rent seeking, anybody got any questions on the things that we've gone over so far with the different kinds of elections or the proportional representation? Sort of good that you know how to explain ranked choice voting, okay? So, all right. Like Arthur Laffer always says, it's not rocket science, but again, it's if you can explain it to somebody else, that's the important thing. In fact, if you were at Richard Ebling's talk yesterday, right? I mean, that's what he was saying, is that you need to go out and explain things to somebody else, why it's important that we have liberty and why important that we have limited government, and make sure that, and again, if you can see a lot of the influence, he's basically a scholar in Austrian economics, but if you had Econ 105, the Constitution of Liberty, in it, Hayek says that the politician shouldn't be an opinion leader. That is, the politician's job is to, he doesn't say this, but what? Go to the median voter, right? So the politician understands I should be at the median voter unless there's alienation, in which I should be at the mode, right? But the idea is, Hayek talks about it, is that the individual has to persuade other individuals, and then once that happens, then the politician will move towards wherever the folks are that, where the people are. So again, when you, why do I have essay questions? So you guys can explain it to somebody else. All right, the next topic that we're going to look at is what's called rent seeking. This is a component of public choice that is an interesting aspect. I have 3 papers in the folder in section 8. One is a paper by Gordon Tullock that he wrote in 1967. One is a Bob Tullison chapter from a book on rent seeking, and the other is a survey of the literature article from 1996. So again, you might want to go ahead and take a look at those readings. But basically, how we started out with rent. Rent was something. It's a return to something that is in fixed supply. Right, so that is in fixed supply. So originally the idea was land is in fixed supply. That was sort of the general idea. And for those of you who have already had public choice, right, we talk about a land value tax, right? So if you put a tax on land, it can't change its composition. You can't make less of them. I mean, the land's there. So that tax tends to be more efficient. People can't respond to an increase in the tax on land very well. Now, in reality, we know that you can move land from agriculture to multifamily housing or to single-family housing, right? The amount of land in any one particular usage can move around. But the big picture is that, okay, land in general is in fixed supply, and so rent is what we've sort of classified what is a return to resources that are in fixed supply. So the idea of rent was then expanded to things like monopoly. That is, you have a sole seller. How many have heard it called monopoly rents, right? Okay, yeah, that's sort of the idea. Again, the idea of a monopoly rent is that they're earning profit which is greater than zero, right? Economic profit's greater than zero when a monopoly happens. So what generally, and Econ 105 or 202, whatever, if a firm's earning economic rent, then other firms will enter. Like if you have a monopoly, you could have a monopoly over your singing ability, okay? So, I mean, each of us has a certain, sound to their music. How many have ever heard Professor Pengrasic play? Okay. Oh, wow. Yeah. So probably no one else can play exactly like Pengrasic, right? I mean, he doesn't sing, but if he did, I sort of thought about that. That might be an interesting thing to do. Just see if he'll sing a song for you next time you're out there. But the idea is that if you could be the sole seller, but you're not earning a monopoly profit, right? So we've got Stephen over here, and he's trying to be a rock and roll star, and he moved to Nashville, and he's playing, and nobody wants to hear him. Okay, so even though he's the sole seller of that product, he's not making monopoly profits. So, but the idea of rent is that this is monopoly rents are basically there's some return that is in excess of the opportunity costs of the resources, right? There's some sort of economic profit. So the monopoly idea is that it's above zero. That's monopoly rents. That's what it's been called. But those get competed away, right? Unless what happens? Unless there's some sort of barrier to entry, right? If there's some barrier to entry, for example, there is some law that says a patent, for example, would be a barrier to entry. And of course, when you think about patent law, again, we talk about this in law and economics and et cetera, but what is a patent law there? A patent law is out there to encourage you to be innovative, right? Because if you're the first one there, you come up with something that everybody likes, then what's going to happen is that you will earn economic profit, but other firms are going to enter, start doing the same thing, okay? So if I can put up a barrier to entry over, let's say, a 21-year period, so you get a patent for 21 years, then what happens is other firms can't enter for 21 years. You know that. You're willing to invest the $5 billion into whatever that innovation is. Now, I don't know if you've been following this as of yesterday, Facebook is changing its name, right? Anybody heard about that? Yeah, there's some sort of, I mean, I don't even know, some sort of virtual reality thing, or I don't know what it is. But now it's not just going to be everybody looking at their Facebook, you know, getting on their phone and checking out their Facebook. They're going to be somehow walking around with it in their brain somehow. I don't know what's going to happen. But the bottom line is that's an innovation, right? And Mark Zuckerberg thinks that people are going to want to do this, and Facebook is obviously investing who knows how many millions or billions of dollars into developing this thing with the idea that they're going to earn economic rent. And so it could be that the government is the one that's impeding entry into that market. Now, so basically rent is the return to a factor that is beyond what is necessary for them to stay in business. Factor beyond what's necessary to stay in business. Again, from principles, economic rent is zero, right? I mean, when you say, or excuse me, economic profit's zero, right? But, you know, when you're trying to explain that to, you know, my 105 class to start with, but you got to say, you know, you could be earning zero economic profit, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't stay in business, right? Zero economic profit means that you're earning the opportunity cost of the resources. You're earning just what you could somewhere else. Doesn't mean that that you're losing money somehow. So the idea here then is that if they're earning more than it's necessary for them to stay in that business, then they're calling that rent. Okay? Now, government can create other barriers to entry into your market other than a patent. So, for example, a steel tariff. So in 2016, for example, the Trump administration put in steel tariffs. And why did they put in a steel tariff? This is 2016. It was an example. That was to benefit U.S. steel producers. Right? So they're benefiting the U.S. steel producers because if they're earning economic rent, what could happen? The Chinese steel producers could enter that industry, right, and shift the supply curve out to the right, driving down prices, and they would still keep entering the industry until profit equals economic profit was zero. But instead, what happens is we put a tariff in that says if you buy from a foreign steel producer, you got to pay what you're paying the steel producer, plus you have to pay a tax. Okay, and that tax then means that the price of the steel for the net price of steel from Chinese steel manufacturers is higher than for the U.S. steel producers, and the U.S. steel producers are happy. Okay? Now, they didn't just get that out of the blue, right? I can tell you, I wasn't there, but I'm telling you, there was a lobbyist there, arguing to make that happen, right? Some big national multi-client lobbying firm was probably in there making that happen. So the U.S. steel producers, they get together, they hire a multi-client lobbyist to go in and get a barrier to entry so that they can earn economic rent, more than earning more than they need to stay in business. So that sort of was an interesting thing to do. So we would call that rent seeking. Okay, rent seeking is where you as an individual or as an association, you're out there trying to get the government to impose a barrier to entry or to do something which gives you economic profit, right? So basically rent seeking is just you seek economic profit by some government action. Okay, so as you might expect, then what, the reality of how this happens is you're the National Association of Steel Producers, and you get together and you hire your lobbyists, and they come in and they use up resources, right? The money that is being used to hire the lobbyist is coming from the steel manufacturers, okay? And so you're using up resources in order to do that. And that's what Gordon Tullock pointed out in 1967. In the paper that I have in the folder, but in 1967, it's called The Welfare Effects of Tariffs, Monopoly. So it's the welfare effects of tariffs, monopoly, and theft. And what Tullock was making an important point about this is that rent seeking, where you're trying to get the government to create a barrier to people competing with you or to give you an advantage, right? If when you're out there trying to get an advantage, what are you going to do? You use up resources doing that. You use up resources in the rent seeking. So rent seeking is not a zero-sum game, right? If what happens is I'm the steel manufacturer, what I win is not exactly what the Chinese steel manufacturers lose, but rather there's a use of resources that's going on to make that happen. Okay, so if I were able to get something where I get the federal government to make it so that I earn $1 million in profit, and you're my competitor, and you lose $1 million in profit, when that happens, that would be what? A zero-sum game, right? We already go back to our game theory analysis, right? A zero-sum game is where when I put in the payoff matrix, right, I only had to put one number. If I put, for running average, or I would put, if I put, 3 there, then the offense is +3 and the defense is -3. Whatever the offense gets, the defense loses. So we've already talked about zero-sum games, but what Tullock is pointing out is that rent seeking is not a zero-sum game, right? Because you're gaining an advantage over somebody else, but you're using up resources in the action of making that happen. So there's a use of resources then in getting to this rent seeking. So again, just to make that comment, so it's not a zero-sum game. Now, if we think about it for a little bit, we'll notice that this has some economic consequences. So basically, how much will you be willing to spend on rent seeking, right? So how much would you spend on rent seeking, right? And just, as an example, I'm going to hire a lobbying firm. So let's say it's the state of Michigan, right? And you are the Michigan Manufacturers Association, and you want to get something passed that's going to increase the economic profit of manufacturers in the state of Michigan. Okay, so what do? You go out and you hire Karubin Associates, one of the big multi-client lobbying firms. You call up Jack Schick, and I'm presuming, I don't know if Jack's retired yet, but so you call up Jack Schick and you say, hey, we want this bill passed. Okay, so what happens? But Karubin Associates is not a nonprofit. I can guarantee you that. So they're going to charge you to do that. So how much are you willing to pay for Jack Schick to go out and lobby for you? Well, what you got to do is you think about the expected value, right? What's the expected value of the success, right? Well, let's put it this way, of the legislation, okay? So let's just assume what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we got a particular piece of legislation that's going to give us an advantage over other people. I'm going to hire Karub and Associates. How much am I willing to pay for that? So what I got to do is I got to look at what's the expected value, right? So that is the return from the legislation, like any other expected value, right? Return from the legislation times what? The probability of its passage. Right? Then what you got to do is you got to compare to the cost, right? How much does Karub and Associates charge you? Well, notice what's going to happen. You hire, let's say you hire Alex's lobbying firm, okay? And Alex is only going to charge you $3,000, okay? Why? Because the probability of him getting this bill passed is 0.1%, okay? So even if the value to me is a lot, right? If the probability of it the probability of it happening is sufficiently low, I'm not going to pay very much for that to happen. But why is, if you look at Karub or Tom Hoisington's firm, or you look at some of the big multi-clients in Lansing, what happens? They're really expensive, okay? Why are they expensive? They're expensive because they can drive that probability high, right? If they're very successful in moving bills through the legislature, what's going to happen? They're going to get paid more. So when you're out there as an individual firm, you're Tesla, or you are a manufacturing association, or you're the Michigan Small Business Association, then you can, when you're making a decision about how much to spend on rent seeking, what are you going to do? You got to look at what's the expected value of the legislation, which is going to be the return from it times the probability of its passing. The higher probability that it's passing, the more you're willing to spend on this. Now, if you that means that people are going to use up resources in the act of rent seeking. Right? So you use up resources in rent seeking. Right? So that's inefficient. If we look at it from an efficiency standpoint, what's going on? We're not producing a good or service in terms of, for us, we're out there just trying to rent seek. And we're going to gain, and even if what we gained was exactly equal to what the others lost, if it were a zero-sum game that way, we'd still have a negative-sum game because I'm using up resources to do that. And so that was what Tulloch's 67 paper was an interesting insight at the time, although 67 is what, like 50 years ago or something? Is that? Well, it's like more than 50 years ago, right? But at the time, that was an interesting insight. Yeah, Steve.
How is it like wasting or losing resources? Because, like, if it's for the company, like wasting resources for the economy?
For the economy as a whole, right?
So how is it wasting resources if it's, I mean, the money's not leaving the economy. You're paying a lobbyist who goes out and buys groceries and takes part in the economy. The money's still used in the economy, so.
But what's happening is you're using up resources in the act of doing what? In the act of simply making it so that somebody is less able to compete with you, so that if you didn't do that, right, you'd be producing actual goods and services. So if I'm, I'm using up, yes, you're right, that Karub and Associates, I mean, when you do GDP, right, if you're calculating out GDP, that'll show up in GDP, right? Because their services will show up there. But what are they actually, what Tulloch is pointing out is in the accomplishment of what's going on for the economy as a whole, what am I doing? I'm only basically trying to transfer resources around. And I'm using up resources in order to transfer resources. And for that, it's not going to be a Pareto efficient state of the world, right? And so Tulloch's insight is that rent seeking is not just I convinced the legislature to give me the $100,000 in profit because I'm Tesla, and now I get $100,000 in profit that I wouldn't otherwise had, and you are, as a competitive company, make $100,000 less in profit. What's going on is I'm going to use up, I might use up a lot of money, or excuse me, a lot of resources in order to rent seek. And then what's going to happen here is that others will use up resources to stop the legislation, right? If you were let's say you were, there's an advantage from what the national piece of legislation is going to do that's going to advantage Tesla, right? And disadvantage General Motors. It's somehow going to give Tesla an advantage over General Motors. What's going to happen? General Motors can't just stand by there and say, "Oh, I guess I'm not going to worry about this," right? What are you going to do? You're going to hire governmental consultants, which is another big multi-client lobbying firm, right? And so what's going to happen is then what we're doing is we're using up resources in order to attempt to just move things around, and you on the other side are using up resources to block people from using, taking stuff away from you, and so that is an inefficiency, right? And notice when sort of thinking about it, big picture, what do we want to do? We want to, if we go back and what does Bastiat say, right, from ECON 105? He says, well, once government engages in legalized plunder, what will happen? The plundered classes will attempt to engage in the making of the law, right? But he says by violent or other means. He wrote the law in 1850, right? So you didn't have a bunch of multi-client lobbyists running around in 1850. Right? But he got the idea is that once you allow the government to advantage one person over another, that one of the things that he defined legalized plunder as being is the purpose of the law to give an advantage to one person over another. And so what he's saying is once that happens, then we're going to have all sorts of people running around trying to defend themselves, and we're spending lots of money or using up lots of resources in order to do that. And what that means is that there's going to be coalitions that will form. Once you're allowing for, just as a comment, I'll get together with somebody else. Once the rules of the game are that you can hire somebody and the government has the ability to go out and give you an advantage over someone else, then what's going to happen is that people will start to form coalitions. Just give you an example. Archer Daniels, right? I don't know if you know of Archer Daniels, supermarket to the world, but what do? They grow corn. That's one of the things that they do. So Archer Daniels grows corn. Now, what are they going to do? Suppose that we have a bill that would be beneficial to the sugar growers. Okay? So we have a piece of legislation which is going to benefit that's going to benefit the sugar growers. What's going to happen is that there's going to be an opponent to that. If what happens is we bid up so it's going to bid up the price of sugar. So just as an example. So I got the sugar growers are out there. They've got an association. They are maybe going to restrict the supply of sugar coming in from Mexico or Haiti or someplace else. Okay? Now what's going to happen is somebody's not going to be happy with that, right? If you sort of think about it, Coke, Pepsi, right? The different soft drink companies, what are they going to do? They're going to oppose it, right? So now what happens is that the Sugar Growers Association goes out and is rent-seeking. They're trying to get a piece of legislation that's going to advantage sugar growers by bidding up the price of sugar, okay? And so they're happy with that, the U.S. sugar growers. But sugar is an input into, not Coke Zero, but Coke, Pepsi, etc., right? So it's an input into that. So they're going to form an association to hire multi-client lobbyists to go out and to block that together. Then what happens is that Archer Daniels Midland, they grow corn. Okay? What's a substitute for sugar in drinks? Corn syrup, right? Okay? So now what's going to happen? Right? If what happens is I bid up the price of sugar, then what's going to happen? The demand for corn syrup is going to go up. And I'll be happy with that, right? So Archer Daniels Midland will get together with the we'll get together with the sugar growers because they now have an advantage as a substitute for something that's bidding up the alternative, and so again the other just think about what else uses sugar, okay? Right? Cereal McKellogg's, right? K-E-L-L-O double good, Kellogg's best for you. I don't know if nobody watches real television anymore, but back in the old days, what used to happen was the way that you didn't use your Fire Stick and get on Hulu or that kind of stuff, right? You turned on your television, and the way that television companies could exist was they sold advertising on the station, right? And so Kellogg's, that was their theme. But the bottom line is sugar frosted flakes. How many have ever had sugar frosted flakes? Okay, good. All right. So sugar frosted flakes, right? So the cereal companies are going to be forming a coalition with the soft drink companies, and so you can see what's going to happen. You're going to have all sorts of people wandering around Washington, D.C. From different associations and different lobbying groups. And again, when I was Nick Smith's chief of staff, the congressman from here, that's what would happen, right? I'd get lobbyists in my office all the time doing what? Trying to rent seek or to protect themselves from rent seeking. And, again, Tulloch's point is that you're using up all sorts of resources to do what? Just try and move stuff around. And if what happens is you block the legislation, what's happened? The sugar growers have spent all this money on, and used up resources in order to get this legislation passed, and it never gets passed. So what's happened is you're back at the same spot, but all these resources have been used up just making it so that the thing doesn't happen. Okay? It's also noticing, another thing to notice is that when you have rent seeking is that associations will have some conflicts within their members. So just to give you, an example here, what about the National Farm Bureau? And just using our example here, what's the National Farm Bureau? If we look at this piece of legislation, the National Farm Bureau, what's going to be happy? Well, who's going to be happy is the sugar growers will be happy, but what's going to happen is that the other group might be in odds, so that you've got some people in the National Farm Bureau that are selling products that are competitive with whatever that you are giving you an advantage for. So you might have some members of your coalition that are opposed to this. So let me just give you an example. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but your federal government does what for gasoline? Right? You ever drive up to the gas station and ever read the thing on there while you're bored? Okay, it'll say 10% ethanol, right? What happened with, as an example, there's a 10% ethanol requirement. Okay, who knows what's going to happen with the Green New Deal or whatever, but there's a 10% ethanol requirement in when you get your gas. It turns out that some engines don't do well if you have more than 10% ethanol. You got to sort of know if you can use 15% ethanol or whatever, depending on what your engine is like. But the bottom line is you were required to use 10% ethanol. Now, if the oil companies are going to be happy with that, or, excuse me, not the oil companies, but the farmers who grow corn, right? And what do you make ethanol from, right? Ethanol is made from corn, okay? So a 10% ethanol requirement imposed by the Congress is going to go what? It's going to make the corn growers going to be happy. Because what? It's going to bid up the price of corn, right? The demand curve for corn is going to shift to the right. And so the demand for corn goes up. Which means that the price of corn, right, is going to go up. Profit is going to be increasing for corn growers. But here's a problem. Within the National Association of the National Farm Bureau, what's going to happen to dairy farmers? Okay? You living in Hillsdale County, should know about dairy farmers, right? What do you feed dairy cattle? Do you feed them peanuts? Right? No, you feed dairy cattle corn, right? So the dairy farmers, they're feeding cattle corn, and so they're going to be opposed. So what happens is in the act of rent seeking, these associations are going to have a conflict perhaps within their members. Within the 10% ethanol requirement that was imposed by your federal government, okay, how did that show up, right? It didn't just show up out of the blue. I can guarantee you that some lobbyists were there representing somebody, and probably corn growers or whatever. And what happened is they got the legislation passed. Okay? And what happens there is, though, when you got to testify, if you're the National Association of Farm Growers or whatever, the National Farm Bureau, whatever it's called, you got a conflict now. You got to deal with your membership. And maybe you know, who knows how you're going to respond to that. Maybe you go, okay, if you, you know, let's let this bill pass, and what we'll do is we'll try and get another bill passed that's going to help you. And so if you're the head of the, I mean, somebody out there is graduated from Hillsdale College and eventually became head of the National Farm Bureau, right? They're out there, they got to figure out how to make this happen, right? They got to figure out how to resolve that conflict with the, when you have competing demands for members of your association. And again, I just wanted to emphasize that Bastiat in 1850 was saying that the plundered classes will attempt to engage in the making of the law, then he says by violent and other means, once the government engages in legalized plunder, which is either taking from one person and giving to another, or if the purpose of the law is to give an advantage to one person over another. So the big picture then in rent seeking is, what is it, right? Rent seeking, how did we get to the term rent seeking? We got to the term rent seeking starting back in the day, you know, when rent was the return to land, and then the rent became the you know, monopoly. Rents are due to a profit more than that's necessary to keep the firm in the industry. So that's how it ended up being called rent seeking. I suppose we could have, what the heck, you might have called it, who knows? But so it's called rent seeking, and what is that about? It's about saying, okay, when rent seeking is not a zero-sum game, when you're using up resources in order to manipulate what the government is doing, and you're going to have all sorts of unintended consequences, perhaps, that come out of that. And that's really what you know, what Tulloch's trying to do, is to analyze what's going on here and notice that this rent seeking is not a zero-sum game. Whatever I get from from you is you know, is a gain to me. But even if it were just flat out zero-sum that way, whatever I gain, you lose. Whatever the corn growers gain, the sugar growers lose. Then still there's resources being used up in the act of doing that. And I already erased it, but you got to look at what's the expected value. When you are deciding whether to hire a lobbyist or not, you got to look at the expected value, the probability of whatever you wanted to passing times the value of whatever it is. And you know, again, you can explain why some lobbying firms get paid a lot more, is they can increase that probability of the outcome happening. All right, any questions on rent seeking? That'll sort of close out the big picture on that. Okay. All right. Again, the articles are in there, and also within the rent seeking folder, I have my notes. You know, a lot of, as I've probably told you a bunch of times, you know, my notes are in there. If you were to return and take this class over again, I could have, by then, hopefully, David Hebert and I will have our book out there, and I can pull off all the notes part. Let me just introduce, and let me just introduce the idea of bureaucracy. Whether bureaucracy may be on the midterm, I'm just going to see how much we're going to get through today and Monday, and if it's not, then it'll be on the final. But certainly through rent seeking will be on the midterm. Okay, so just quickly in the last couple minutes, let's just give you what we're going to talk about when we talk about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy. Sort of again, you know, if wife used to be a second grade teacher, so try to watch my not my handwriting. She doesn't inspect that, but you know, watch my use of grammar and spelling. But basically, the picture is that bureaucracy was, for most of its sort of lifetime of analysis, was talked about by the sociologists and political science. That's what people were, mostly that had the most interest in studying what bureaucracy is about. That was clear up until the 1970s. Now, that's not quite, anybody, how many have read anything by Mises? Okay. All right. Mises actually wrote a big book on bureaucracy in the 1940s. Okay? But not translated into English until a little bit later. But big picture, if you were looking at who's studying bureaucracy, it's mostly sociologists and people in political science. Those are the folks that were looking at bureaucracy. Again, there's, not to say no economist was working on it, but that was what the main feature was in terms of who was looking at this sort of thing. This idea is then, what are we concerned about in economics? It's right maximization under constraint. Right? That's what, your economic analysis is, everybody in here is probably how many are not an economics major? I haven't even thought that before. How many are not an economics major nor a political economy major? We don't seem to be attracting everybody in, I guess. Or maybe we're so good that you guys decide to become a major. Once you've had some classes in economics, you go, oh my gosh, this is the thing that I want to major in. But sort of the bottom line is, what are we looking at in terms of a bureaucracy from a public choice perspective, from the economic side of things, is that, what do? We're going to try to examine what what's going to happen if we're trying to maximize under constraint. And what's the deal? Bureaucracies don't sell things at a per unit price, right? And that's one of the things Mises was talking about, and I'll give you a little quote from that. But you don't sell things at a per unit price. So what we'll do for Monday is we will start to work our way through the next folder, the next chapter, the next folder section is in bureaucracy, and go ahead and take a look at that. How many have ever seen the movie Catch-22? Oh, okay. You should look at Catch-22. It's a very interesting movie. Take a look at Catch-22 if you have something Hulu or whatever it is, and do that over the weekend.